The session covers the Success by Design Solution Blueprint Review. We'll start with an overview of the Solution Blueprint Review. So Solution Blueprint Review Workshop is intended to allow the architect to ensure that the overall solution scope and details are really understood in a structured manner, not just by the partner, but by the customer as well. This workshop ensures that the solution design concepts are sound, not necessarily the details, but that the basic concepts are sound. One of the key benefits of the Solution Blueprint Review is that doing this workshop at the beginning of an implementation helps drive communication with the implementation team. So it starts the discussions about the deeper hows and whats we're going to build that allows us to find anything that might be misaligned or things that may have been forgotten. As with everything in Success by Design, the Solution Blueprint Review is really about preventing issues and mitigating risks early on in the project before they have a chance to really cause problems. And from a reviewer's perspective, the Solution Blueprint Review really provides an opportunity to find out the breadth of the solution and to use that as a way to baseline the rest of the Success by Design engagement. Through the things that we find in the Solution Blueprint Review, we're able to plan out what additional deep dive or implementation workshops are required. So as I already mentioned, we do the Solution Blueprint Review at the very beginning of the project. The idea here, in keeping with that concept of detecting issues and risks early and being able to mitigate them, means really getting that broad understanding early on. So just as the project is starting up, we're going to want to do a Solution Blueprint Review. So we're going to talk a lot about how we do a Solution Blueprint Review. But for a minute, let's talk about a few specific things. So we want the Solution Blueprint Review to be based on material that's coming from the team. So we want the team to be able to ideally be able to communicate at least the basics, the core concepts, the scope, and the general design concept that the solution is going to be based on. And that should be available in the Solution Blueprint template. In some cases, teams will push back, and we want to remind on when we're going to do the Solution Blueprint Review, and we'll remind them that the idea is to really be able to do this up front, do it early, to be able to provide context for the larger engagement. There's a template provided that'll help teams gather the Solution Blueprint content and make sure they have what we need for the review. The team will present and discuss those deals with the FastTrack team. Keep in mind, this isn't about creating a blueprint, but it's about reviewing what's there and the concepts that are already in place. This whole thing is about identifying risks and issues to keep everyone safe. So it's well understood that the implementation team will collaborate with FastTrack to identify those risks. And then based on those risks and issues, we'll take action to resolve issues in the project. So let's talk through the overall process. First thing to think about is knowing what you're going to go review. So if I'm a reviewer that's going to conduct a Solution Blueprint Review, I want to make sure I'm familiar with the concepts, the topics, the items, and the questions that are going to come up in that review, as well as the models behind how we think about the responses that'll come back. Once we have that done, we can plan that out. And so that's really about determining what inputs you're going to get from the project, what attendees should be there, and how you're going to execute this, what mode you're going to get in. And we'll have some content a little bit later that talks more specifically about that. Once you've got it scheduled and ready to go, then you can execute. Execution starts with reviewing the input materials that you collect and then conducting the workshop to collect additional findings. Coming out of that workshop, you've got a whole bunch of findings. We can now produce that into a series of detailed findings that can be classified as issues, risks, and assertions that we can now provide recommendations against. Once we have those, review those with the implementation team and get their feedback. We take the final findings and publish them out, and then we'll follow up on those findings to start to mitigate risks and close issues. As I mentioned in the earlier presentation, we sometimes get pushback on doing the Solution Blueprint Review up front. Teams might object and say, we're not ready to do the blueprint yet. We just started the project. When you think about a project that has a budget and a timeline, an expectation of what's going to be delivered and when it's going to be delivered, there should be some level of blueprint underneath that estimate and that approach to the project that's gotten us to that budget and timeline. That can be the basis of a solution blueprint review. If we don't have a solid solution concept that those key factors are based on, that in and of itself is an issue that we should identify and address as quickly as we can. We also get objections that, the scope and the approach is a little bit loose going into the analysis phase. And once we go through analysis and design, we're going to know more about really is going to be built, and we expect that there's going to be big changes. So by proxy, we should wait to do the solution blueprint review until that's complete. If you think about that, that's really not much different than the first objection. What that's saying is we really don't know what this project is based on, and we're expecting things to slide. We should look very closely at projects like that and try and understand what's going to slide, what those variables are, so that we can all be on the same page, customer, partner, Microsoft, and understand what needs to be done to stabilize those factors. So let's dig into planning for the solution blueprint review. As we prepare for the solution blueprint review, we're going to gather as many details, as many artifacts as we can before we go into the workshop. Now, in the early stages, we're talking the first weeks of a project, when you look at the various artifacts that are up here, we're not necessarily going to have all of these in detailed form. We may not have, an entire project plan with thousands of detailed lines. We may not have all of our detailed requirements, and maybe even our processes are soft. But what we should have is in each one of these areas, the basic scope and a general idea of how we're going to approach the implementation. Things like process catalog, as a framework, give us a basis for the functional scope of a solution. Project planning, we should know, once again, what that targeted go-live date is, but also generally how we're going to use our time in between now and go-live. So what are the phases? What are the general durations that we're going to have? Those are the kinds of things that'll help us understand whether or not we have a solid foundation in the solution blueprint, or if there are things that should be dug into to really shore up the project and make sure that it's safe. So we need to plan for how long a solution blueprint review is going to take. And what you'll see here is it really sort of depends. Generally speaking, a solution blueprint review is going to take somewhere between a couple of hours and around 8 hours. Now, how long it's going to take will depend on the applications and the scope of the solution that we're reviewing. Simple solutions, maybe based on a single CE application, might be closer to that 2-hour range. If we look at ERP implementations, things that involve Dynamics Finance, supply chain, commerce, or even potentially a combination of CE and OAG apps, we should really think about that solution review taking around 8 hours. Now, what we don't want to do is generally go too much past 8 hours. If we're going too far past the 8 hours, if we need much more time than that, it probably means we're digging in a little bit too deep for what's expected in an initial solution blueprint review. And we should really start to focus on really those larger concepts. So there are things that can stretch this out, make it a little bit longer, or might inform us how long it's going to take. Part of that's how much is known up front. The more detail that we have, so if we've started this late in the project, we might know a lot more. There might be more details to cover. It might be harder to press those things out. The complexity of the implementation, the approach that's being taken, all those sorts of things that might add additional variables that would drive us to dig a little bit deeper, ask more questions, are all things that might push that duration out a little bit. It should be noted that when we're dealing with the 100K to 300K band of FastTrack, the Microsoft architect won't actually run that solution blueprint workshop. The solution blueprint workshop will be conducted by the FastTrack Success by Design architect within the partner organization. And then following that workshop, Microsoft FastTrack resources will spend about 45 minutes reviewing the outcomes of the workshop and helping to suggest recommendations to be made to the project. Execution modes. This can be done in a variety of different ways. Typically in the past, for larger solution blueprint reviews, so thinking again, finance and operations, operations applications, group applications, we would have typically went on site and taken that 8 hours as one continuous day just to make it efficient for travelers and those sorts of things. Today, in today's world, most of what's being done is remote. So we think about when we structure the workshops, we'll typically break this into a couple or 4 sessions. In option 2, what you see here is a potential example of how you might group those sessions to kind of keep some continuity in the subject matter. Ultimately, it comes down to picking the right schedule that's going to work for you and the implementation team that you're working with. To determine who should attend the workshop, we look at a few things. The mandatory participants. Project managers and architects on the implementation should definitely be there, and that includes customer project managers, partner project managers, and customer partner architects. Those resources that really form the core of the implementation team and the leadership of the implementation team should be there for the entire workshop. It's important for those resources to be a part of that communication that the Blueprint workshop, review workshop drives, and so that they can understand the full end-to-end complexity and structure of the solution. Now, subject matter experts, and whether they're on the partner side or the customer side, can potentially be there for the entire workshop. But one of the things you should keep in mind is, if it's a large project and we start to get many participants in the workshop, it might be difficult to manage and to facilitate. Too many people, too many questions, it'll be hard to keep to that 8-hour time limit. And if we have too many people that really aren't participating, we may just be wasting some of their time. So we can certainly be inclusive of the entire team if that works, but we need to pay attention to whether or not we can really facilitate it with everyone in the room. One of the things to keep in mind, if this is partner-driven 100K to 300K band project review, in that case, the partner organization needs to provide and staff the Solution Blueprint Review Workshop with an architect that's conducting the review, as well as the architects that are actually running the implementation. We shouldn't ever do a Solution Blueprint Review where the architect that's driving the implementation is reviewing their own solution. Next, we'll talk about executing the Solution Blueprint Review. To start off, let's review a few execution tips. We need to strike a balance between the breadth and depth of what we cover. Right? So we want to go deep enough in the review to uncover problems, but we want to be sure we're not solving those problems in the workshop. Keep in mind that it's better to get the breadth of the solution and identify all the issues than it is to solve any specific issue. Once you've identified a risk or an issue, you can take that in the notes, put it in the parking lot. Those issues and risks can be followed up later in implementation workshops. Sometimes when we review, we may look at a whole area of the Solution Blueprint Review and the implementation team will simply respond, they don't know. It's important to understand that when the project we're working with can't provide an assertion about a particular area of the Solution Blueprint Review, that doesn't mean it wasn't covered. Saying we don't know what we're doing for data migration, saying we don't know what we're doing for the ALM strategy, or we don't know yet, is actually a very significant finding. Right? So we need to make sure that if we haven't covered something because we're not ready, that doesn't mean it was left out. That is the finding. Sometimes there's an ask to do a partial review. These are the things that we're ready with. Let's dig into that review, and we'll push things off for later. Sometimes when we get into that mode where we do multiple sessions, those sessions get spread out too far apart. When we split it up into multiple sessions, those sessions should still be covered within a week, 2 weeks max. The idea behind this is the solution blueprint review is about the breadth. Right? When we provide feedback and guidance to the implementation team, we want to do that in the context of the overall knowledge of what's going on. If we only see bits and pieces of the solution, it's risky to provide that guidance without knowing that larger context. So we'll talk a little bit about solution blueprint content. Overall, within Success by Design, we define a number of workshops, the solution blueprint review being one of those. And those workshops, they really provide the opportunity to engage and to drive impact. We also provide questions. So those questions that we ask, the items that we drill into, those inspection points allow us to really take advantage of that opportunity. And then the patterns and the knowledge that we have behind these questions in terms of the anti-patterns we're looking to avoid, the known good patterns that we're looking to promote, those really give us the knowledge to then provide the impact in a positive way to the implementation team that we're in the project that we're reviewing. What we're going to go through next is a series of slides that talk about the content and the various topics that are involved in the solution blueprint review. It's important to understand that this is not an exhaustive set of topics, questions, and review items. These are just some areas, some specific things to help you get an idea of the types of content that gets covered in each section. We'll start with program strategy. Key things that we're looking for here. Does the project understand the goals and objectives, and do they have, in a documented form, the measures and metrics that they're going to use to define success for the solution? Having that type of information handy is important not only for declaring success after the solution goes live, but it can also be used throughout the course of the implementation to ensure that we make strategic decisions that drive towards the impact that we're looking for. Talk about governance and methodology. We need to understand that there's a known methodology in place and we're not just making this up as we go. Well, most projects will have a solid methodology because the partner organization will bring that. We also need to understand if that methodology has been trained with the broader team, including the customer participants, so they really understand their role. It's also important to understand, have we decided to take customer elements of their methodology and partner methodology and blend them together, and what kind of risks does that pose to the project? We'll look at project schedule to understand things, to understand if big things are there, right? Things you would typically expect. Also to understand, are schedules realistic? Have we pinched certain parts of that schedule in ways that are going to cause risk or add risk to the project? Look at the requirements gathering approach. Make sure we're focusing on the right things, that we're focused on the to-be, and we've got a plan to really gather requirements from those people that are equipped and qualified to provide requirements, and we have a way that we can drive out what's needed to implement the solution. We'll also ask questions about how those requirements are going to be managed. Are we capturing the requirements and using them in a way that they will drive downstream implementation activities? Business process strategy. So part of the business process strategy is looking at the business process scope or catalog. We want to understand, is this an implementation that's solidly grounded in a set of business processes and ideally the underlying scenarios or user stories that will really define what we're trying to do with the solution in the business. If we don't have that, we may have risks around really understanding the true scope of the solution. Is there a solid structure of the process architecture? Is it being used to manage the solution? Meaning, do we have clear connections between the processes that we have in scope, the requirements that will be driven out from them, how those will connect to test cases and onto training materials, and really complete a cycle that allows us to capitalize on that initial scope in the new solution. We also look at factors of complexity. Business processes could be a single set of processes and user stories for the entire business. It could drastically change if there are multiple groups of constituents involved in the solution, with each one having their own sets of user stories and potentially even their own requirements. Understanding the complexity of what the project is dealing with is key. Application strategy. At its base, it's really understanding the bill of materials, if you will, for the solution. So what are we going to include in the solution? What new package components, including Microsoft Dynamics 365, as well as other Microsoft Azure components, or maybe even other new third-party components that will be included? Do we understand what they are up front? And have we included them in the environments that are going to be used to implement the solution? What legacy components are we going to keep? These are the things that will generally drive integrations and may have various challenges in terms of what their capacity or capability are and how they'll support the implementation. And of course, we'll also look at new developed components. And these are the things that are going to be based on essentially gap requirements. If we know about key gaps early on in the project, it's important to understand what the strategy is around them, why we've defined them as a gap, and how we're planning to address them. Data strategy. You can sort of think about this in two major categories. One is understanding the data that's managed within the new solution. So things like master data and the various parameters around master data, including volumes, whether that master data is sourced directly within the new solution, whether it comes into the solution through external integrations. The same thing for transactional data. What transactions will be created and managed as part of the business processes that are in scope? Which ones will flow into the solution through integrations to legacy components or other third-party components? And what are the processes that we're using to manage them? The second big category is about the migration of legacy data into the new solution. And it's important to understand what the scope of that is and what the approach of migrating that data will be. Now, once again, in a solution blueprint review, we might not have the details, but we should understand what needs to be done, and we should have a general idea of how we think we're going to do that. And as always, understanding volumes of performance is very important. And so understanding the volumes of data that will both be mastered and trapped as transactions within the solution, as well as the volumes of data that will be migrated into the solution is key. Integration strategy. One of the key things here is looking at interface scope and ideally going into a solution blueprint review. As part of the template, we provide an interface register. And what we want to see there is that the integration scope is really expressed as interfaces. It's a very different thing to say, I need to integrate with 3 systems, than it is to know what the collection of interfaces will be that will make up those integrations. We'll look for areas where we might not fully understand that and understand how we can surface, how we can clarify those aspects. Once we understand that interface scope, then understanding what the patterns will be that we see for interface technology. And sometimes we may not have all that detail in the solution blueprint review, but we will want to understand what the team's thought processes or method will be to derive the interface technologies that they will use. We look at various non-functional requirements of the interfaces. Throughput and response time are a couple of the key things that help drive interface technology selection. And then, of course, we look at the middleware approach, middleware technologies, that will be used to manage the integrations at a large scale for the entire implementation. Intelligence strategy. So the business intelligence strategy, reporting strategy, all of these sorts of things sort of make up a microcosm of its own within the solution. So first and foremost is understanding, do we know the scope? Do we know what reporting is included in the solution? What reporting is going to be derived from integrated solutions and things like that? How are we going to drive out reporting requirements? Hopefully we're not doing things like copying reporting requirements from old systems. Hopefully we have ways to actually go through business processes, and we're planning to trap reporting requirements along that business process, whether it's a report that starts a process or a report that ends a process as a way of validation. Understand basic technology strategy. Is this stuff that's going to be done inside the solution? Is it stuff that's going to be done outside the solution? Is it a mix? And where is the data for business intelligence going to come from? Is it only Dynamics 365 data, or is it a mashup between D365 and legacy data, or D365 and other peer business applications in the enterprise? Security strategy. At the solution blueprint level, it's not so much about digging into the roles and the privileges and those sorts of things that will make up the solution going forward. There's time to dig into that in implementation workshops later on. For a solution blueprint review, it's key to understand the big rocks issues around security, especially if this is a customer's first step into the cloud. So do we understand the models of the solution and how they will fit with the larger enterprise? So authentication models, needs for special network access control, things like compliance and different testing, could be penetration testing or other areas. How does that get done, and is the team aware of how those things can be fulfilled within a cloud environment? Other big things around security is data residency. As we look at what our instance strategy will be and where those instances will be located, understanding any regulatory restrictions is an important underlying factor in making those architectural decisions, as well as data privacy. Making sure that at a solution blueprint review, the team is aware of these types of issues and thinking about it as they go through the implementation will help us stay on a good footing. Application lifecycle management strategy. A big part of an implementation is really being able to manage that process of how we develop and configure the solution and get that through a series of pre-production environments, test phases, into an eventual running live production system. There's a variety of factors, but some of the big ones that you want to understand is the team prepared with a pre-production instance strategy? So do we have the right environments in place to facilitate in an efficient way the lifecycle management process that we have defined? Do we understand how to use DevOps in conjunction with Dynamics 365 to manage a variety of aspects, not just source code, but also all of those artifacts around processes and requirements and tests that will wrap around the code and the configuration as we move towards production? Do we understand the continuous update requirements of Dynamics 365 and any other connected cloud solutions? And has that been planned into the lifecycle management strategy? Configuration management, part of that overall flow, but important to understand how we'll move configuration data like source code through each of these environments and eventually through tests and into a production solution. Environment and capacity strategy. So this is really planning. The production instance and those key factors around it that will help ensure that we can run and operate the solution efficiently in production. So the first is understanding the instance strategy itself. Is this a single production instance, multiple production instances, locations, and things like that? Understanding the overall process of operations around business continuance and disaster recovery. So in the event of a catastrophic failure, does the customer know how Dynamics 365 will react? And do they know how much of the solution is covered by the Microsoft service and the provisions that are provided for BCDR? Is there a plan for those sort of adjacent elements of the solution to be able to mirror the capabilities of Dynamics 365 in an event like that? Location deployment scope. So where are we deploying to? Where are our end users located? And how does that affect system usability in terms of things like latency planning? And then, of course, underlying this, those things will help us ensure that we have not only proper instance strategy from operating schedules but also performance. So what are the volumes of transactions? What are the workloads that coincide? How do those map out across a typical day in the life? Knowing those things and making sure that up front in the project we're starting to capture these and pay attention to these, make sure that when we need them later on in the implementation we have them. Let's talk about how we complete the solution blueprint workshop. As we mentioned in the process overview, once we complete the solution blueprint workshop itself, we now have a set of findings that we got from reviewing incoming artifacts, and we've got the findings that we captured as part of the review workshop itself. The architect that's facilitating the review will take those findings back and process them to make sure that they are structured in a way that the team can understand the finding, understand how we think about that finding, whether we think of it as a risk and issue or just something that's an assertion that we want to track, and then provide the right recommendations. Now keep in mind, for the 100K to 300K band, that production of the findings will happen with the partner architect primarily producing those findings and then reviewing them with a Microsoft FastTrack architect. In the 300K and over, Microsoft FastTrack architects will actually prepare and produce those findings. Once they're produced, we'll review them with the team. Now, generally speaking, we don't change findings based on review or pushback from the team, but in some cases, we may have misunderstood something in the workshop or in the artifacts, and it's okay to clarify things that have been misunderstood or missed. Once we get done with that review with the team, we'll finalize that review and publish it so that everyone has a copy of it. Now that published review should go not just to the implementation team, but it should go to key stakeholders for all parties, so that everybody's informed of the general health and status of this implementation going forward.